Welcome back to the deep dive. We're diving deep today into some fascinating ideas about story archetypes, Jungian psychology, and even something called the Cipolla stupidity matrix. You've sent us some intriguing diagrams and notes here, and I'm excited to unpack it all with you.
Yeah, it seems like you're really interested in understanding, the forces that drive stories forward and maybe even how those connect to human personality types, which is something I'm quite interested in as well.
Yeah, definitely. And you've been making some interesting connections between those classic story archetypes, your heroes, your antagonists, the sidekicks, and their corresponding Jungian archetypes like the ego, the self, the shadow. Can you walk me through how those connect?
Well, they both sort of tap into those universal patterns of human behavior and motivation that we are kind of recognize, right? Like take the classic hero archetype.
Mm-hmm.
In storytelling, they're usually driven by a sense of justice, a desire to right wrongs, and that really aligns with the Jungian ego, which represents that sense of self, our purpose in the world.
Okay, yeah, I see that. And you've even started mapping these archetypes onto the Cipolla stupidity matrix, which I have to admit really caught my eye. So tell me more about that. How does that work?
Well, it's a fascinating concept. Basically, the Cipolla stupidity matrix, it's a way to classify people based on not just their intelligence, but more importantly, the consequences of their actions and how those actions impact themselves and others. And it's broken down into four quadrants. You've got intelligent, you've got bandit, you've got helpless, and then, of course, you have stupid metric.
Okay, so how do our familiar story archetypes fit into this matrix? Are all heroes destined for the intelligent quadrant while the villains languish in the stupid one?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because it's not really about inherent intelligence, but rather the consequences of their choices within their stories. Like, for example, your classic hero, even though they might be clever, they often end up in that helpless quadrant. And why is that? Because they're willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, even when it means putting themselves in harm's way. Their actions benefit others, often at their own expense.
Yeah, that's actually a pretty good definition of a hero when you think about it. Someone willing to put it all on the line for others, even if it means they might end up getting the short end of the stick.
Exactly. And that tension, that's what makes those stories so compelling. Now, you contrast that with, say, the antagonist, who's often operating from pure self-interest. They might be incredibly clever, cunning. They might even appear intelligent on the surface. But their actions, particularly their willingness to sacrifice others for their own gain, that lands them squarely in the bandit quadrant. Good for them, potentially disastrous for everyone else.
So it sounds like this Cipolla stupidity matrix, it's not really about just calling people stupid. It's more about understanding the impact of their choices on themselves and the world around them.
You got it. And that's what makes it so useful when we're trying to analyze these classic story structures. It helps us to understand why certain characters make the choices they do and how those choices ultimately shape the narrative, even if it goes against what we traditionally think of as intelligent behavior.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I have to ask about this whole idea of drivers and passengers that you mentioned earlier. It sounds like you're saying that some archetypes are just naturally more likely to take charge, while others are more along for the ride. Could you unpack that a bit more for me?
Yeah, absolutely. It's just like in a car, right? You have those archetypes that are naturally drawn to being behind the wheel, driving the action of the story. Your protagonists, your antagonists, the mentors, the ones who shake things up, push the plot forward. And then you have your passengers. Now, this doesn't mean they're not important to the story at all. They're essential for providing support, maybe challenging the driver, offering a different perspective, or reacting to the choices that are made. Think of your classic sidekicks, love interests, or even those wise old sages who always seem to show up at just the right time with a cryptic piece of advice.
So to use your analogy, are you saying we all have a little bit of driver or passenger in us, depending on the situation we find ourselves in?
It's a fascinating concept to consider, isn't it?
Mhm.
And there's actually a surprising amount of evidence to support that, especially when you start to connect these archetypal roles to personality types. For example, have you ever heard of the Myers-Briggs personality system?
The Myers-Briggs. Oh, yeah. I've always found those personality tests intriguing, though I never really considered how they might connect to these archetypes we've been discussing.
Well, let's dive into that connection then, because I think it might just change how you think about those personality types.
Yeah, the Myers-Briggs system, with its 16 distinct personality types, actually aligns really well with those driver and passenger roles we were just talking about. Like, for instance, you take the protagonist, the one who's always ready to jump in, take charge, initiate the action. They often align with what we call the STP type sensing, thinking, perceiving. These are the folks who are really grounded in reality, very logical, adaptable, always ready to kind of take on a new challenge.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. But what about the antagonist? They can't be cut from the same cloth, can they? Oh, absolutely not. They're quite different. The antagonist often aligns with the NTP type. So that's intuitive, thinking, perceiving. They're the big picture thinkers, the strategists, the ones who really like to kind of poke at the status quo. It's fascinating to see how when these personality types are plugged into a narrative, they almost naturally kind of gravitate towards these roles.
You're really making me rethink those personality tests. But how does this all play out in the real world, beyond the pages of a script or a novel? Does our personality type mean we're stuck in these roles? Are we all just acting out some kind of pre-written script based on our Myers-Briggs type?
It's a great question. And it gets to the heart of how we understand these systems. It's not about predetermination. It's more about recognizing patterns. You actually highlighted a really interesting example in your notes about the shift in journalistic focus from heroes to antagonists, particularly around the turn of the millennium, that whole Y2K era.
Oh, yeah. I'm fascinated by how the news, at least in my lifetime, has really seemed to shift from celebrating those who are solving problems to almost obsessing over the ones who are creating them.
It's a really astute observation.
Mm-hmm.
And we can actually think about that shift through this lens of archetypes in the Cipolla matrix. Remember how we talked about the helpless quadrant being often occupied by those who are willing to sacrifice for the greater good?
Mm-hmm.
What happens when the narrative consistently spotlights the ones who exploit that helplessness? The bandits, as it were.
It feels like it could create this kind of, widespread cynicism. Almost like this feeling that good deeds are naive and that self-interest is the only real strategy for getting ahead.
Precisely. And it's not to say there isn't a place for, examining wrongdoing or holding people accountable, of course. But when that becomes the dominant narrative, it does create a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, right? It really influences how people view the world and how they behave within it.
So then how do we break free from this cycle? How do we shift that narrative back to something, more balanced, more hopeful?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I think part of the answer might lie in understanding the very systems we're discussing. When we recognize these archetypes at work in our stories, our news cycles, our everyday interactions, we start to see the patterns, the motivations, and maybe the potential consequences of the choices that we make, both as individuals and as a society.
It's like being handed this decoder ring for human behavior. But even if we can recognize the patterns, changing them seems like a whole other challenge.
You're absolutely right. Awareness is that crucial first step, that foundation upon which we can then start to build change. And one of the most intriguing ideas you brought up in your notes is how these concepts of archetypes and personality types can help us understand not just individual behavior, but the dynamics of entire social systems, even on a global scale.
You're talking about that idea of emergent properties, right? How large populations can almost take on a collective personality of their own, a bit like an ant colony.
Exactly. Think of it this way. Just as an ant colony's behavior is determined by the dominant personalities within it, the workers, the soldiers, the queen, the human societies also seem to exhibit these emergent properties based on the prevalence of certain personality types and the archetypal roles they tend to embody.
So a society with a high concentration of, say, guardians, those who really value security, tradition, order sever, they might be more risk-averse, less open to change.
Potentially. Well, a society with a higher proportion of, let's say, creators, those driven by innovation, self-expression, pushing boundaries, they might be more dynamic, more creative, but perhaps also more prone to instability or conflict as those new ideas clash with the existing structures. The key is recognizing these are tendencies, not absolutes, and that understanding these dynamics can help us to kind of navigate these complex social systems in a more conscious, intentional way.
I've got to say, this is all incredibly fascinating, but I have to admit, it's a lot to unpack. Maybe we could take a step back for a second. What would you say is the key takeaway here? Why does all of this really matter, especially for our listeners? So much of what we've talked about today really resonates, but if we had to distill it down, what's the one thing our listeners should take away from all of this?
I think it really comes down to this. When we understand those archetypes at play in, the stories that we love, the news that we consume, even just our everyday interactions, we gain this incredibly powerful lens for viewing and understanding our own lives. It's not just about analyzing characters on a page or dissecting, societal trends. It's about understanding ourselves, our motivations, and the roles that we play in these larger systems.
It really is like holding up a mirror to our own personalities and behaviors. It makes you wonder, am I more of a driver or a passenger in my own life? What really motivates me? What are my strengths? Where do I stumble? Where do I fall into those predictable patterns?
Exactly. And it's by asking ourselves these questions that really get to the core of who we are and what drives us that we gain that deeper sense of self-awareness, which is so essential for personal growth. And, when we can apply that same lens to the world around us, then we can start to become more conscious, more intentional participants in actually creating a society that reflects our values.
So to bring it all back to our listener, they've given us a lot to think about today. From those classic story archetypes and how they map onto our personalities to that fascinating Cipolla stupidity matrix and what it means for understanding the impact of our choices, it's clear that they are already on this journey.
Absolutely. And, I'm really eager to hear what resonates most deeply with them. Is it the idea that we all have a little bit of the hero and the villain inside of us? Or maybe the realization that understanding these archetypes can help us navigate these complex social systems that we're a part of in a more informed and effective way.
Definitely a lot to unpack here. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding. We've scratched the surface of some really big ideas today, but the real journey begins with that internal exploration, right?
Absolutely.
So to our listener, we leave you with this. As you continue to explore these concepts, ask yourself, which archetype do you most identify with, and how does that shape your interactions with the world around you?
Because maybe by understanding those roles that we play and the forces that drive us, we can begin to write a new story, both for ourselves and for the world that we all share.
That is a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time for another exploration into the fascinating world of ideas.